Good afternoon, folks, and welcome to the third day of the Southport Winter Whisky Festival. We've got a big day ahead of us. We've had two pretty good fun days behind us, and I have to say I'm pretty excited to introduce Catoctin Creek. Scott Harris, who I met at the Soho Club probably maybe even 3 years, certainly 2 years ago. Has got up out of his bed early in the morning and is going to take us through four of his rye whiskies. How are you, Scott?
Hey, how are you guys? Welcome. Thanks for joining me on this third and final day of the Whiskey Festival. It is 9 o'clock here, so not terribly early, but definitely pretty early for drinking whiskey. But the wife's not home, so I guess I can do that. So I'm in my home bar today. This is the only bar we're allowed to have during these COVID times, so we're making great use of it now. Finally,
I was a bit kind of thinking you were trying to go into competition with me with that background, but it is impressive.
I don't like to think of it as competition, but maybe mutual collaboration or something.
Very good, very good.
Yeah. So cheers and welcome everybody. Thank you guys for jumping on the call this afternoon. I'm going to run you through today the history and a lot of the details about our whiskey and our company. We are Catoctin Creek. Catoctin is a Native American word from the Algonquian Indians, which are the Indian tribe that are in the Virginia area here. And the word means the land of many deer. So we have many, many deer here, white-tailed deer, more so now than ever because we have no large predators anymore except for the automobile. So plenty of white-tailed deer all over the place here. But Catoctin Creek, we are a 12-year-old company. So I say we, that's Becky and I. So Becky Harris and myself are the married couple that founded Catoctin Creek. We are married still after having done so. And basically, we were both engineers. Becky was an engineer in chemical engineering, making things like contact lenses, computer parts. And I was an engineer doing computer science stuff, software engineering. So I worked for the US Navy, making equipment that went on airplanes and things like that. So all kinds of engineering. And somewhere around my 40s, I decided that I could no longer sit in a cubicle staring at a laptop doing PowerPoint charts for the rest of my life. And so I brought the idea of making whiskey to Becky. My thought was that since she's a chemical engineer, that she could be the master distiller and make the whiskey for us. And so I brought the idea to her and said to her, I want to start a distillery, to which she said, "You're crazy." And I said, "No, you're a chemical engineer. You could make whiskey." And she said to me, what she said in reply was quite surprising. She said, "Of course I could make good whiskey. Distillation is easy." From her perspective as a chemie, I guess distillation isn't too hard. But she said to me, "But can you make money making whiskey?" And that was really the challenge. And that's the challenge we still try to do today. So, it's a difficult business with lots of difficult channels into distribution and things like that. But we've been doing it now for 12 years and making a good go of it. And just launching this last quarter and into January into the UK for the first time. So super excited to be part of the Southport Whiskey Festival as the only American brand there. And you'll soon be seeing our rye much more available in the UK. So we're very thrilled about that. We've been working for 7 years to get into the UK. And every single thing in the world has sought to slow us down, whether it was Brexit or COVID or tariffs and all of these horrible things. And finally, we're making some headway. So when we started the company, what enchanted us was the history of whiskey in America, a history that was mostly forgotten in the early 2000s. And so I'm going to relay some of that history to you guys now. So when the first permanent settlement in America was established, this is 1607, the Jamestown Settlement by British people, of course. The very first thing they started doing there, apart from eating and drinking, was making whiskey. So a gentleman named George Thorpe was the first one recorded on paper to have started making whiskey in the area. And we were making whiskey in Virginia from then on. So for over 400 years, we've been making whiskey in Virginia. Now, remembering, of course, up until the Revolutionary War, 1770s, we basically had almost 200 years of existence in America as the colonies. And a lot of Americans, I think, forget that. They believe the country started in 1776. But there were nearly 200 years of people living here. And during that time, people were making whiskey. The grain in the mid-Atlantic colonies, so here I'm talking about Virginia and Pennsylvania, Maryland, all the way up into New York and even into Canada, that grows best is rye. So not corn, which many people think is America's first spirit, that being bourbon, but actually it was rye. So rye, growing really well in the Virginia area, was harvested, and nearly every farm, every homestead would distill small amounts of whiskey for their personal use and to trade with their neighbors to generate a little bit of cash. Distilling the rye grain was a way to preserve the crop. It didn't rot or mold. It wasn't eaten by mice. And you had something that you could use for drinking, for selling as money. You could also use it for solvents, for paint thinner. I mean, it was basically, alcohol was the spirit solvent of choice. So it was generally made in very small batches all over the Commonwealth of Virginia. And something that we would call craft today, right? It was a small home pot still. It was done with local grain. We would say influenced by the terroir of the Virginia area. All of that out of necessity. There weren't supply chains to get malts from Wisconsin or from other places. Wisconsin didn't even exist yet. So all of it was very much necessarily local production with local handmade recipes and traditions passed down through generations. And that's the way it was clear into the 1700s and into the early 1800s. So that kind of production of small scale rye whiskey was something that we very much wanted to emulate when we started the company. Now, if we continue the history a little bit further, 1776, of course, we have a war, and King George III gets quite pissed off with us for having a war with him. And some major things happened. So before the war, even though we were making small amounts of rye whiskey all over the nation, it was very, very small amounts and used for basically home scale use. Oh, somebody's entered the waiting room. Let me add them in. I guess I have to add people in now that I'm the host.
Yeah, you're the host, Scott. You're in charge.
I'll let them in now that I see it. Actually, I can set it so they just automatically get in. But I'll do that later. Anyway, so by 1776, the number one spirit in America wasn't whiskey, it was actually rum. So rum was coming up from the islands, sugar and raw molasses and rum, finished rum from the islands as part of the British trade between the Caribbean, the US, and Great Britain. And so rum was everywhere. Well, after the war, King George III was pretty pissed off with us and cut off the supply of rum. So now Americans had a real crisis because they needed more spirits than they were producing at the time. And so as we were had all these little small scale production farm distilleries making rye whiskey, suddenly it became industrial. So in the next 10 to 20 years, 1770s through 1790s, you see an enormous jump in production of rye whiskey. In places like Pennsylvania now, large factory industrial distilleries are being established, producing in the western part of Pennsylvania called the Monongahela region, producing a signature style of rye whiskey out there. Another signature style now establishing itself in Maryland, and now rye whiskey takes over as the dominant spirit in the Americas from then on. And so we pass into the 1800s, and adding, we're not on a drink yet, Chris, we will be shortly. As we get onto the 1800s, we start to get into the cocktail development, and the uses for spirits grows even further. Manhattans and old fashions and Sazeracs and all of these things. So rye whiskey, of course, still being dominant in the eastern part of the US. New York City, a major cocktail development area with major world-class bartenders, all using rye whiskey, not bourbon. Typically, you would be drinking bourbon if you were in the frontier. And here I'm talking about the West. And this was the West of the early 1800s, which would have been Tennessee and Kentucky and Ohio and all those kinds of states out there. So most of the people in the population centers of the colonies were drinking this rye whiskey. And that's what we really sought to emulate in producing our rye whiskey for you today. So we've got 4 expressions today that we're going to go through. I'm going to save them for just a bit longer as we start to get into them. And what I'm going to do next is jump in and show you a quick presentation of the distillery, where we're located in Virginia, and a little bit about that, just so you can see some pictures of what we look like over here across the pond. And then we'll jump into starting to taste these whiskeys. I will say lots of cool chats already going into the chat. Continue to do that if you like. I'll try to keep an eye on them and answer them as I can. But don't be afraid to unmute yourself and ask me a question and interrupt. I don't mind any bit whatsoever. So, all right, I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to share my screen with just a few photos to show you from the distillery. Everybody should see the bottles now. Do you see that?
Yep.
All right, good. I see a thumbs up. Thanks, Owen. All right, so then our core values at Catoctin essentially mirror those 1800 production techniques. So we are going to be a single barrel whiskey, which means every single bottle came from one single barrel. We're not cross blending bottles to make our delicious whiskeys. Small batch, and when I say small batch, I mean distilled and brewed in 300-gallon batches. So pretty small, each batch yielding approximately 1 barrel of whiskey. Handcrafted, of course, you'll see that in the photos. We never sourced. So over here in America, you can find quite a lot of whiskeys that are actually bottled somebody else's bulk whiskey. If you're familiar with American whiskey, you've probably heard of MGP, Midwestern Grain Products, fine company in Indiana that makes lots and lots of whiskey, and a lot of people will bottle it and call it craft. Becky and I didn't quit really good day jobs to bottle somebody else's whiskey. We wanted to make whiskey and make it from scratch. And so that's what we do. We've never sourced a drop. Local and organic rye. So we're big believers in terroir. We believe that the climate and the soil and all of those things affect the flavor of the spirit. We see that when people taste it out in the field. They notice it tastes different from stuff coming from the Midwest. And that's because it comes from Virginia. We are a 100% rye. That's quite difficult to make a 100% rye. The rye is quite sticky and it has to have some special processing to deal with that stickiness, but the flavor is worth it and it really differentiates the product. We get that really nice pop of flavor from that rye. And then most importantly, saving the best for last is it's a pot stilled whiskey. Just like the Scottish method, we're really adamant about that pot distillation process as affecting our flavor. Most of the whiskeys here in America, bourbons, are actually column stilled, and that is quite a different process and doesn't yield the same richness that we get in the flavor of the whiskey when it's pot stilled. So we're big believers in that. All of that is to say then that we are the Virginia rye whiskey. We are producing rye whiskey in this Virginia style. So when we go to places abroad, London or Las Vegas or Los Angeles, and we are talking about whiskey, we'll often say, I know you've heard of Kentucky bourbon, but let me tell you about Virginia rye. And this is what we're talking about. That's just a picture of me and Becky, Becky being the chief distiller and president of the company. And then I am general manager running all the business side, sales and marketing and whatnot. A lineup of the products. So here today, we're going to taste the 3 on the left, the Roundstone Rye 80 proof, the 92 proof, and the Cask proof here. We sell a gin as well, but today this is a whiskey club, so we're going to be tasting the Rabble Rouser, which is our very rare bottled in bond release that we got just specially for you guys to taste. It's not really available much in the UK or overseas yet, so you guys have a really rare treat to taste the Rabble Rouser, and I'll be talking about it more in detail. There's a picture of the distillery. We sit on Main Street in a small town, about 8,000 people. The distillery here is this brick building in the center. We sometimes call it the Alamo. It kind of looks like the Alamo. It's a 100-year-old building next year. It was Percival's first Buick dealership. So in 1921, right in the midst of Prohibition, this building was built and established as the first car dealership selling Buick automobiles, back when Buicks looked like horseless carriages like Model Ts or something like that. On the right-hand side of the building, as you face it, would have been the showroom where they sold the cars and had them sitting in the windows, those big windows on the street. And then the left-hand side was the repair shop where you could come and get your car fixed or even gassed up. In the early days, they didn't have gas stations, so you had to come back to where you bought it to get gasoline to run it. So we found some neat artifacts in this building as we were restoring it. It was a Buick dealership for 51 years, clear into 1972. So in my lifetime, actually. this building was still selling automobiles. And when we bought it, it was a furniture shop. So they were selling really nice high-grade cherry and walnut furniture in this building. The proprietor who had owned it and his family since the building was built had passed away, and it was a bit of luck for us actually to pick it up and turn it into this distillery. Purcellville itself was actually a prohibition town. It was one of the epicenters for preaching against the evils of alcohol in a building we have in town called the Bush Tabernacle, where lots of Protestant evangelicals would come and talk about the evils of alcohol. So it's a bit of a middle finger to history that we've put a distillery right on Main Street in the middle part of our Old Town district. They actually had to change the town ordinances to allow us to exist, but the mayor, a bit of a whiskey nerd himself, was quite excited to help us get established at the time. So inside the building, on the side where all the auto repair was done, we put our distillery, and this is where we make everything that we make. We are a really small building. We have about 15 employees, but in this small space, we can make quite a bit of product for selling. We have 2 pot stills. These are hybrid German pot stills. So they have some plates in them for some rectification that we get. The biggest difference in that from our process from, say, a Scottish method is that we can do a stripping run and the finishing run in one run. So instead of 2 runs as they do in Scotland, we'll do 1 run. But we still do the distillation very similar to how it's done in Scotland. So our 2 stills, Ron, the big one in the back, and Barney, the smaller one in the middle. Ron is our full-time whiskey still, and Barney being the auxiliary still that we use for brandy, for gin, and for other types of things when we're distilling them. Barney being the first piece of equipment we bought when we started the distillery, so our original still. Then, of course, we have our mash tank, and not shown are the fermenters as well. So this is the other side of the building, our beautiful tasting room, which is mostly empty now because of COVID. But a great room where we can let people come when they visit and see the distillery and taste some of our spirits, taste some of our rarer collection of things that we don't often sell into the market. A really nice room also for parties and things. We are a solar powered distillery. So we have 44,000 watt solar array hidden on our roof behind that facade. It's kind of nice that the facade is there because it maintains the historic look of the building, while we have this ultra modern solar farm sitting on top of the roof, generating about 85% of our electrical needs in the distillery from this solar plant. So quite sustainable and quite a green advance in the distillery. We were excited to put this on as it brought down our electricity costs substantially once it was installed. And there's just a nice picture of Becky and I. I just like it because it's a nice picture. So there's our tasting room, quite a busy party there. That was one of our opening day parties. And the lineup of spirits. So we do make some other spirits. As you can see, we've got some brandies here. This is peach and pear brandy in the picture, plus some gin as well. But mostly we're just distributing the whiskeys internationally. And there we go. That's a nice picture. So that, folks, is Virginia. That's about 5 minutes from where I live. These are the Appalachian Mountain Range. We call them the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is the Shenandoah Valley. So the Shenandoah River, which flows north and meets the Potomac River, which flows sort of easterly, dumping into the Chesapeake Bay. All of this then is the terroir, the region that we're talking about. So when we talk about things like water, our water is in a reservoir not far from this photo called the J.T. Hurst Reservoir. It's Appalachian rainwater that runs off and collects in this reservoir, which is then piped into town. That's the water that we use for mashing and for bottle top off. Those minerals in that water are very important to the flavor and the unique nature of the whiskey that we're producing. If we were to put reverse osmosis or pure deionized water in the bottle filling process, it would be tasting flat. It wouldn't have the same flavor as it does by using this local Virginia water. So that's a really important part of it, and people often neglect to talk about that. Plus the climate that we have. These mountains greatly affect our climate. So we have very, very hot summers, very humid summers, and very, very cold winters with lots of snow. We just finished having about a foot of snow a week ago, just before Christmas. And then we have crazy springs and falls that have great temperature swings day to day. So it can be in Fahrenheit, it can be 40 degrees one day, and the next day it could be 80, and then back down to 30 the next day. And those crazy swings in weather with all the storms they bring drive us nuts, but it's really good for the whiskey because the barometric pressure shifts that we see really push the whiskey in and out of the barrel like a sponge, causing quite a lot of interaction with the barrel in a relatively short amount of time. So these beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains here. This is actually the Catoctin Creek. So this is our little Appalachian deciduous rainforest climate that we have here. So if you climb through these mountains, this is what it looks like. Lots of moss and things growing, just a beautiful, beautiful area. My wife and I, in our spare time, love to hike. And this is the kind of thing that we see all the time in the spring and summer. This looks like late spring, perhaps. So just another part of our land and what makes our whiskey taste the way it does. This is Becky here on the left, visiting with our dog Otto. Our rye farmer, one of our rye farmers named Timmy in Rappahannock. So Virginia has quite a diverse climate and quite a diverse geography. So this is about 3 hours east of us, sitting right on the bay, the Chesapeake Bay, where the land is flatter and more warm, more temperate because of the influence of the Chesapeake Bay, under this beautiful pecan tree on his farm. So this was a trip last July, about 2 weeks before the harvest of the rye. We wanted to go down and see the rye, meet with Timmy, talk a little business, and just get some nice photos of the rye as it was maturing in the farm. So jumping here, you can see from the photos that the rye is nearly 6 feet tall. Becky's about 5'11", so it's nearly as tall as she is in here. As I said, this was about 2 weeks from harvest. So there's the first variety. We like to use a lot of heirloom varieties of rye when they make sense. Sometimes they don't. We had one of our researchers at Virginia Tech University told us, sometimes heirloom varieties are heirloom for a reason. They don't want to work with modern equipment, or they're just subject to all kinds of bugs or pests and things like that. But we find varieties that do work for us in collaboration with our farmer. This is a variety called Hazlitt. As you can see here, it's still a bit green, so still a couple more weeks left before it was fully ripened, ready for harvest. But looking quite nice, quite healthy, with lots of great looking stalks there. Rye, of course, if you're not familiar, very much like wheat as far as the way it looks, the way it grows, but completely different in flavor. Wheat tasting very sweet and somewhat thin flavored, and rye having a little bit more of a spicy kind of backbone to it. The same difference between, say, a white bread and a rye bread, a Jewish rye bread, which has a little bit more flavor than what the white bread does. The second variety of wheat here, this is called Ryman, and this one is almost ready to harvest. It's much more yellow and golden in color, and it was about 6 inches taller than the Hazlitt was. So a couple different varieties that we use here. Our methodology for choosing rye from the farms, we have about 4 farms that we work with, and they come from different regions, north of us, east of us, one right here in the county where we are. And we choose all those for a couple reasons. One, it's smart to have diversity of farmers. In case one farmer has some bad harvest, then we're not totally lost for the year. But the other reason is we get a diversity of flavor. So the farm that grows our rye in the far north, the rye has a very sweet, mild flavor. The sweetness is pleasant, but it doesn't have much depth to it. Whereas this rye growing here in the Rappahannock region with the hot, humid summers it's seeing develops a really rich, spicy backbone. By building a rye mash of these different component ryes from each farm, we're able to get a complexity of flavor while still being a 100% rye. So that's one of the nice tricks that Becky's done to build up a really interesting flavor profile without just sourcing from a single farm. This is Becky, just a glamour shot of her looking at the rye. And then what do? Well, we bring it back to the distillery and we mash it, just like everybody would do. So we get a big kettle of hot boiling water and we mash in the milled grain, creating essentially a great big porridge. This porridge is stirred and cooked and cooked and stirred for about 6 hours as the enzymes will start to break down the starches in that rye grain, breaking apart its viscosity and breaking those long chain carbohydrates into sugars that we're going to need for fermentation. After we've done that, we cool it down to room temperature, and then we pitch our yeast and pump it into our fermenters. So we have 6 fermenters. We can do 6 batches a week. And into the fermenters it goes, where it starts to become beer. The big difference in beer from what you might drink is that we don't strain out the grain. So all the grain chunks are still in there. It still looks like porridge while it's fermenting. We jokingly call it a beer smoothie at the distillery. And in the early days, when we first started making it, of course, I thought it might be quite neat to taste it and see what it tasted like. So I pulled a pint of this beer smoothie and drank it happily and realized that it's really not a beer smoothie. It's much more of like a Metamucil smoothie. It's quite high in fiber and definitely not recommended to drink a full glass of that. But it was delicious and quite nutritious, I suppose. The other major differences from beer are that we don't use any hops in this recipe. Hops generally not allowed in whiskey. And then finally, our yeast is a special distiller's yeast, not a brewer's yeast. So the brewers will leave behind some sugar, which gives the beer body and flavor and all kinds of things. But for us, sugar left behind is lost opportunity. We want to make that into our full, complete whiskey. So we want every bit of sugar turned into alcohol. What that leaves us with is about 300 gallons of mash at about 10% alcohol. So if you do the math, we've got about 30 gallons of liquor hiding in that batch that we're going to get and put into a 30-gallon barrel. So at which point we bring it over to Ron on the left and distill it. Our distillation method is pretty close to traditionally Scottish, as I mentioned. So we have a traditional heads, hearts, and tails of our distillation, just as they would in Scotland. We have all the mash goes into the pot. We tune the plates to get the level of rectification that we want on it. And then we start to boil it. The mash is boiled by a large steam jacket that surrounds the mash, that silver part at the bottom, and it brings it to boil quite quickly. 300 gallons getting to boil within about 30 minutes, which is pretty incredible. It takes me longer to do that on the stove with a pot of rice than it does at the distillery. The vapors start to ascend into the column, and then at the top of the column, not shown, is the line arm, which is a large pipe that runs over to the right and down into the condenser, the thin silvery tube next to Ron there. The first vapors, of course, coming off are the heads, the non-drinkable alcohols that come off at the beginning of the distillation. And here we're talking about acetaldehydes and methanol and acetone and things like that. These are set aside, and we actually will use them for cleaning chemicals. So we'll clean and sterilize our pumps, our hoses, the fermenters, all kinds of equipment that we can clean with that alcohol. We simply don't drink it. And in fact, this year, a great amount of that alcohol was donated to use as hand sanitizer for the COVID emergencies that we were having, giving it to hospitals and sheriffs and police and fire departments and places like that. So that was a nice way to contribute something that we would otherwise just use for cleaning around our own distillery. Then after the heads dissipate, we get into the hearts, of course, the good stuff, what's going to become whiskey, our new make spirit that coming off the still. This is not an automated process. This is completely hand done. So every 5 minutes or so, one of Becky or her distillers will walk over to this stream of alcohol and taste it. And she'll determine, are there flavors coming through that she doesn't like, that she wants to hold back, and she'll adjust the cooling system to either open it up or close it down a little bit to recondense those bad flavors back into the pot or to let them through. So it's completely done every single day since we've started 12 years ago by hand, tasting every batch all the way through. It'll take us approximately 9 hours to distill each batch. So quite a lengthy process, quite inefficient compared to the column still process, which could do the same amount of work in about a ninth of the time, about 1 hour for the whole bit of it. But we really choose to deliberate and do this slowly and carefully to get the best quality spirit through this still. One of the most important factors of the pot stilling process is the what Becky calls the Maillard reaction, which is simply a fancy way of saying cooking. So as the rye is in that still cooking for 9 hours, there are incredible changes that are happening to it. It's caramelizing, it's becoming richer, there's sugars that are becoming revealed, and things that are coming across as congeners in the distillate that comes out. And that's why we get, even at the 80 proof, such a rich tasting spirit coming through. The analogy I like to use here is one of like making tomato sauce on your stove. So if you take vine tomatoes right off the vine and puree them in a blender, they'll taste quite acidic and quite sharp. And if you take them and then cook them on the stove for 4 or 5 hours, you'll see they become rich and reduced and caramelized. And it's a whole different thing, tomato sauce, from this freshly pureed tomatoes. And that's the same kind of changes that we're seeing in the rye as we cook it through the day, producing this rye whiskey. At the end of the process, of course, all of those things that we held back, the fusel oils, which taste nasty and smell of mold and aren't really desirable in the whiskey, are held back into our tails of our distillation. The tails are then accumulated, and unlike what we do in Scotland, where they take them and put them into the next batch to recoup any lost ethanol, we will actually accumulate all of our tails separately, and when we have enough of them, we'll redistill them in barley. By doing a second distillation in barley, we can remove those fusel oils and recover about 80 to 90% of the ethanol that would have been lost. That ethanol now having not much flavor because all the flavor was pulled out during the whiskey run. And so we need to flavor it. So we'll introduce into it juniper, coriander, cinnamon, anise, orange peel, etc. And that makes us a gin, which is truly a byproduct of the whiskey production.
That's really interesting that you do that. That you basically use the waste from the whiskey to make gin. I've been telling my wife that.
Yeah, it's a delicious gin. You know, once we introduce those herbs into it, they'll soak and macerate for 24 hours, and then we pull the herbs out, usually donating those to local chefs who will use them for all kinds of things like rubbing salmon and making bacon. But then we will distill it once more in barley in a pot still, and it's one of the few pot still gins, which makes it quite velvety. There's quite a lot of botanical oil in there, so it has quite a nice mouthfeel and quite a rich flavor in that. So it is rather an interesting gin.
Yeah, I'd love it if you send 2 or 3 cases over, and we'll sell it in the local bar.
Yeah, for sure. We'll talk about that after. If I ever come over, we can do a tasting as well once we get to traveling once more.
Yeah, cool.
So after we've made the new make spirit, it's time to fill the barrels. And these are our 30-gallon barrels. We use a variety of oak, 2 varieties actually, a Virginia oak and a Minnesota oak, both of them being white oak, both of them being charred to what we would call a medium char, or number 3 char, kind of halfway on the spectrum. And then just like bourbon, you know, they fill up those barrels, and now we can truly call them whiskey. At that point, it is time to take the barrels out to the barn to age. So we don't have much space in our distillery for aging of barrels. So we load them all into our box truck and take them all out for aging. This is a picture of Becky standing on the truck, and Desi, our distiller from Ireland, actually. I don't think you're a legit American distillery if you don't have an Irish distiller. They just know a lot about whiskey, I think. So we'll load the truck up with these, and then we'll take them out. This is Becky in the summertime. We have to do 2 inventories a year for our federal government rules. This is the summertime inventory. By her attire, you can tell, where she simply goes through rows and rows of whiskey, counting the barrels, making sure they're all present and accounted for. The larger barrels laying on their side are the Rabble Rouser barrels. So for those, we're using a 53-gallon barrel, the larger barrel being more friendly to the longer aging process. So the Roundstone Rye typically aging between 2 and 4 years, and the Rabble Rouser typically aging 4 years plus. So we're getting a lot different kind of angel share issues with the smaller barrels. The smaller barrels, if they're left to go much longer than 4 years, the angel share starts to become something close to 30%, and that's just unacceptable in those barrels. The first time we took a 4-year-old out of the 30-gallon barrel, we put 30 gallons in and we got 20 gallons out, and that is really crushing to have happen. So now we've upped our Rabble Rouser program into the larger barrels. A picture of my son. Someday maybe he'll come over with me on one of the trips. He is our national brand representative. So he was doing all of the whiskey shows before COVID started. He lives in Texas and reps for us down in Texas as well. This is one of our restaurant partners. This is a private barrel selection where we have various barrels. This particular barrel was a tequila barrel that we finished the Roundstone Rye into. They loved it and they brought it into their restaurant group and are selling it through their bars in the restaurant group here in Virginia, Washington, D.C. area. It's a nice little way to have some unique whiskey, the barrel program, and we do it for bourbon clubs as well. So perhaps someday we can do some barrel samples for Southport and see if you guys are interested in some really unique finishes we have, things that are a little bit not run of the mill.
Sounds good.
By the way, there's a big leaker right behind the guy here. That's a really big leaker of a barrel just over his head there. It happens, unfortunately. Once the barrels have aged long enough, we'll bring them back and bottle them. So the bottling of the whiskey is an interesting process. Becky will take the barrel samples and she usually assembles a team of her female employees. She feels that her female employees have a better taste sensation for the whiskey than what do the male employees. All of us just say, it's great, it tastes good. But the women can really tease apart some of the flavors. And so they'll sample the whiskey straight from the barrel, first evaluating it for aroma and smell and aroma and taste and viscosity and all of these things, and deciding which variant to make it. So 90% of the whiskey coming out of the barrel will be soft and buttery and have a really nice taste at 80 proof. And we'll bottle it as our 80 proof rye, which is our most popular spirit. Every now and then we'll get a barrel, about 1 in 10, that will exhibit a more spicy nature, more interaction with the wood than the other barrels have had. Most often this is with the Virginia wood. We'll see flavors of nutmeg and clove and things like that coming into play. And that'll get bottled as our 92 proof Distillers edition shown here. And every now and then we find a barrel that's just immaculate as is. Don't add any water to it. Let's keep it just exactly cask proof. The harmony between the grain and the wood is perfect, and we'll bottle it at cask proof. So by bottling, selecting those flavors into the into the 3 different expressions, we're able to get consistency within a single barrel product line, where we don't have to blend across different barrels and ages as do the larger producers. Every bottle is hand numbered, and then we have it ready to sell. So that is my brief little presentation. Of course, we're all over social media, so please check us out at Catoctin Creek everywhere pretty much. And that's a beautiful double rainbow. How about that? So that's the end of my screen share. Before I get into the tasting of the whiskeys, I know you guys have been very patient and I greatly appreciate it. I would be happy to answer any questions and then we'll get right into the tasting. Oh yeah, I see some now in the chat, now that the chat's come by. Yeah, Virginia is not so bad. Some great songs. Yeah, we have the claim, I guess, John Denver, Country Roads. That's basically written about the Shenandoah Valley, not far from here. And the rivalry between Virginia and West Virginia is absolutely there. We have many jokes in a bathroom. Often in the restroom, you'll see signs that say "flush twice. It's a long way to West Virginia," things like that. So yes, there's the usual state rivalry. The angel share, good question. The angel share typically for us is around 10%, and that's about as much as I can tolerate. We have very humid summers in Virginia, and so when we talk about humidity, you can think of the air as full of water, which means that water does not evaporate easily in that environment. And so what does evaporate then is alcohol. So when we load the barrels with the new make, they will go into the barrel at 119.5, so just under 120 proof. So that's about 60% ABV. And as they sit, they will actually drop in proof and usually coming out somewhere around 116 proof. So that's pretty typical for our aging that occurs in our warehouse, where we have no air conditioning, no heating. It's subject to the climate as we want it to be. For some of our special projects, and here I talk about brandy and some of the barrel finishes, we will actually bring those barrels to the distillery where we do have climate control. And in those cases, when you have an air conditioner running, the air is quite dry. And in that case, we will see the proof increase over time. So we'll get barrels coming out at 125 proof or even higher. And so those are a great joy when we see those happening. But it's amazing to me how humidity affects the angel share. When did mixed mash bills become a thing? So mixed mash bills here in America have been a thing for a long time. I mean, every bourbon is a mixed mash bill of different things. Most bourbons being something on the order of 60% corn plus 30% either wheat or rye, plus maybe 10 or 5% barley, malted barley. That's a pretty typical like Four Roses type mash bill. Or you can have rye mash bills where you have 60% rye plus corn plus wheat plus barley, et cetera, et cetera. So most American whiskey is a mash of those four different grains, at least usually three of those four grains, sometimes all four. It's unusual then for a 100% rye to have a mash bill. We would normally not talk about such a thing, except that we do have an interesting story to tell there. If you were getting all 100% from one single place, there's not much to say. Speaking of Four Roses, are you experimenting or noticing any differences by using different yeast? So that's a great question. I love what they do out there with the different yeasts. Most of our experiments with yeast have pushed us back to using the yeast that we have. We have a scientist that is one of our investors who generated a yeast strain he wanted us to use for the whiskey and try it. And we just couldn't get it to go. We couldn't get it to ferment at all. And it makes you appreciate, there's a lot of talk about wild yeast over here and things like that. And even brewers who will talk about yeast that was pulled from their own beards to make beer. And all of that sounds romantic, but at the end of the day, we want something reliable, consistent, with high quality. And so we continue to use the single yeast that we've been using since we started, just to get consistency as a small company. Yeah, great questions, guys. Virginia looks not bad. I'll agree. It's a pretty wonderful place to live. Actually, as you drive through our county, Loudoun County, you could be quite convinced that you were driving through someplace in Britain. These rolling meadows and fields with hedges and stone walls and things like that. And you can see why the British decided to settle in here for good way back in the 1700s. So anything else that I missed? If anything else I missed on the chat window, feel free to pipe up. Otherwise, let's get started drinking. You guys have been so patient already.
Quick question.
Yeah,
barrels, is it true that you're only allowed to use your barrels once? Do you believe
that is true? Yes, indeed. Once and only once. So when we're finished with our barrels, we typically will sell them to either local breweries or other spirits producers, and sometimes to the public who will use them to make furniture and things like that. But we can only use those barrels once and only once. And we have actually sent some to Scotland as well. So our barrels are 30-gallon barrels, so they're smaller than the normal size barrels. So most Scottish producers aren't interested in our barrels, but the larger bourbon barrels, of course, find lots of second use over in Scotland.
Very good. So
that's actually a federal law, believe it or not. That the one-time barrel use thing, it's been in the law books since the 1800s.
Yeah, I believe you've got very strong Coopers unions that will not allow that law to be changed.
yeah, either that or the lumber lobby. Right. Lots of wood being used. People sometimes quite appalled by hearing that, but it is a renewable resource. It's a crop. It grows just like wheat. It's just a much longer cycle to grow. But forestry here in the U.S., if you've ever driven in, for instance, northern Minnesota, you can drive for an entire day and see nothing but trees. So it's not necessarily a diminishing resource. It's one that's fairly easily managed. The question popping up just now, do you think the tariffs with the UK will change with the new government? Yeah, I do actually think that'll happen. Now that you guys got Brexit out of the way, I guess we'll see how that shakes out. That's another big factor that had a lot of people sitting on pins and needles. But with the new government coming in, assuming that the present government lets them in, we should see a reduction in the tariffs and things returning hopefully to normal with European trade. One of the things that I also heard was that Brexit would create some new opportunities because Britain would be looking for new trading partners now having gotten out of the EU, and the US, of course, being a natural trading partner for the Brits. So perhaps we'll see some US-UK trade deals coming soon as well.
Very good.
Yeah, it is great news.
Okay, Scott. So let's try some of your whiskey.
You bet. So if you've got your samples there, guys, let's find the one that says 80 proof, and we'll start with that. This is what the bottle looks like here. So we see 80 proof on there, and single barrel Virginia rye whiskey.
So the
So let's start with that. If you've already poured some.
The samples are labeled. We haven't labeled them 80 proof. We've labeled them Roundstone Rye Distillers Edition, Cask proof, and Rabble Rouser. So this is the Roundstone Rye.
That's right, just the regular Roundstone Rye.
Yeah.
And it is at 80 proof, so our nice starting proof. Beautiful amber color here, should see. And if we start with the nose, right away, I start to get citrus as some of my first elements in the nose as I taste it. Oh yeah, thank you. This is a Whiskeys of the World glass, a festival over here in the US that produces quite a nice glass for nosing. So this is a lovely, I get, again, that citrus element in the nose, maybe even a little bit of citrus peel, citrus rind, that bitterness almost, and that beautiful sort of grain backbone, cooked bread, things like that. So let's go ahead and take a taste if you're ready. And right away, I get that beautiful pop of rye spice that tells me this is not a bourbon, this is not a scotch. This is a rye, a totally different flavor on the flavor spectrum. No corn in that whatsoever. You get a little bit of sweetness, but then we get all of the beautiful stone fruit. So one of the big characteristics that's different in our rye from other American ryes is most American ryes are made from malted grain, which produces a green, grassy, herbal kind of flavor. So here I'm talking about flavors like mint and dill. But in ours, we really tend more towards the fruity, nutty kind of flavors. So more like pecans and plums and cherries and things like that. So I'm getting a lot of those big stone fruits in this whiskey right now. The spice note is what draws you in. Yeah, vanilla and maple, absolutely. Vanilla coming from the barrel. Maple is just a natural sort of flavor tone of our whiskey. And we actually have one of our barrel finishes is a maple barrel finished rye where they were using barrels that were aging maple syrup. And that takes that maple note and really brings it up nicely. It's a nice finished whiskey.
I mean, that sounds like that sounds like one to do. I think if we were gonna choose a finish, maple syrup sounds.
Yeah, it's really nice because it's not a sweet. We're not trying to make a liqueur, where it's sweet and sort of a flavored, trashy whiskey. What we have basically is a non-sweet whiskey with just a higher note of maple in it, and it's fantastic stuff. I'd be happy to get you some samples.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
Oh, sorry. Somebody, Mr. Shoop, said not buying the tasting set. Well, you could still buy some bottles, I suppose.
I might be able to find you once, Fiona. Next time we'll send the box down, or if you remind me or remind Chris, we'll see what we've got. We might send you one.
Yes, this is quite lovely. This is the stuff that we started the company with. This is the stuff putting my children through university. So please keep buying it. They're not quite done yet. But this 80 proof rye, our most popular spirit across the US. The reason being, I think, just approachability for price, for quality at that price, and approachability also for flavor. People who are not experienced drinkers of rye, this coming from bourbon has some of that same sweetness, and it gives people something that they can really find approachable and drinkable.
I mean, we've got this on at £37 a bottle, which seems very, very reasonable. What kind of dollars would you sell that for locally?
Yeah, so here in Virginia, we have the highest retail pricing because our state is a government control state, which means the state controls everything of the alcohol. So here in Virginia, this goes for about $45 US.
Okay.
So I don't know what the current pound exchange rate is, but that's probably about the same.
Yeah, it's about the same.
After the exchange rate, yeah.
That's pretty good considering shipping and getting it over here. It's very good. Yeah, this is lovely. It's got a little bit. Don't get me wrong. We get very limited ryes, I think, over in the UK in that sense. That's sort of craft and easy to get hold of. But this is it's definitely got a little bit more of a buttery feel to the mouth compared to. I've only ever tried really sort of Lot 40, some Willet, and some Russells, and they're much more in that bigger spice territory. But this has definitely got that softer mouth feel, a little bit buttery. Lovely.
Yeah, yeah. Buttery is a term that I use quite often. It just kind of describes the velvetyness of it, the oil content, because we're doing such a rich pot distillation, we're getting quite a lot of oil content through it. And these are, of course, never chill filtered. So in most commercial whiskeys, they chill filter and pull out all those fatty acids to make the whiskey look absolutely crystal clear all the time. And we prefer not to. So if you were taking this up into the far highlands of Scotland where it gets quite cold, you might see it cloud up and haze up a bit, but we prefer that to keep the flavor, understanding that you can always just simply stir the bottle to absorb the cloudiness and the haze. So that's kind of why we've decided, and left this 80 proof rye as a non-chill filtered variant. So I am going to dispense of my 80 proof very religiously there into the sink. And I'm going to pull out the 92. So grab your sample of the Distillers edition. Once again, I'll highlight this one, 94 points at the Wine Enthusiast 2020, rated their third highest rye whiskey in the nation. So we're quite proud of that, quite pleased with that. This is our Distillers edition 92 proof. Now, what's remarkable about this one is you'll notice quite a difference in the flavor, but it is exactly the same new make. So the only difference in this whiskey then is what's happened in the barrel, the things that we can't control. And so we simply segregate out those flavors rather than trying to develop or control them. You'll see the same similar kind of beautiful natural color that's completely from the barrel. We don't use any coloring over here in the US. And so it's just a beautiful golden kind of amber color. And we'll take a nose on this one as well.
Much richer nose.
Yeah, yeah. Here I'm starting to develop flavors of almost coffee and leather and things like that are coming in that weren't coming before. Very nice. And richer flavor, right? More of that spice, baking spice here. I'm talking pepper, white pepper, richer fruit flavors. Yes, quite nice. Some cola kind of flavor coming through.
That's a very nice drink.
Yeah, this is our house favorite at the distillery. So all the employees on their shift drinks will drink this. This one, if you're into cocktails and you're not just drinking neat, beautifully mixable because the higher level of alcohol really shows up well in the cocktail. So all of those traditional old fashions and Manhattans and Sazeracs and Boulevardiers and all those beautiful whiskey-based cocktails. This is a really lovely one coming in right there. Balancing the bottle on the glass on the bottle, that's probably going to lead to disaster. All right, any comments, thoughts on this one? Yeah, if you're going to order a single bottle, this would be a good one to order. I'll probably change my mind after drinking the next one. Yeah, Steve's getting the leather, coats your tongue. Again, that pot distillation, those oils are playing in there a long time. I like the comment, Ewan, melted orange chocolate. Yeah, that's a nice comment as well.
I think I remember when we decanted these into the tasting packs. I really enjoyed this one. And I don't want to steal your thunder, but when we got to the cask strength one, that was for me so it was kind of like, yeah, I like that. Oh, I really quite like that. And then it was, wow, that's great.
Yeah, that's kind of how I roll as well. This one is kind of approachable. You can't drink cask proof every day all the time, I think. So sometimes it's nice to step it back a bit and drink this one here. But a perfectly beautiful whiskey. And again, trying to be completely representative of those whiskeys that we've seen from the 17, 1800s. We actually got our hands on a bottle of 1800s whiskey from the area and tasted it against this. One of our investors had a bottle that they often, when they restore some of these old houses over here, will find bottles stashed away in the walls. And I guess that's one of the benefits of Prohibition, is people squirreled away a bunch of whiskey and then forgot about it. And one of our investors gave us a bottle and told us to drink it. He said he didn't want us to just hold on to it and collect it. He wanted us to taste it and see if we could learn something from it. And what we learned is that we quite liked it. And it was quite similar to what we're producing, similar flavors. This one did have, it was a rye whiskey, but it did have some measure of corn in it as well, which was common to have multiple mash bills back then as well. And so it was similar. But once we had finished, we had this historic empty bottle. And I wanted to display it, but I wanted to display it with brown liquid inside. And so I refilled it with some of our own Roundstone Rye and put it up on the shelf just for display. And then I sort of started to bemuse that, wouldn't it be funny if somebody came along and said, hey, let me taste that old bottle. And we've always been saying we try to make it like the old style. And they say, wow, you guys really nailed it. It tastes just like Roundstone Rye. So if you ever see the bottle, if you come to visit, you'll know it's not worth tasting. It's already what you got. Slight hint of something floral perfumed riding on the richer flavors. Not sure what. Yeah, sometimes we have those little floral flavors coming through. Not sure if I can pin it down either, but some beautiful just essences coming from perhaps the yeast. All right. So the 92 proof, very nice whiskey indeed. All right, moving along, if we're ready, I'm going to get just a splash of water here. It's good to stay hydrated. You'll notice I'm not adding any water to my whiskey. A lot of people do, and that's fine, but I just prefer to taste it as is. I don't need to open it up. We already opened it up when we added water at the proofing process, is my feeling. Hints of chili, sweet chocolate. Yep, I see that. Spice lessens as water is added and chocolate gets more prominent. Absolutely. I can totally get that. Let's see. All right. So we're going to go next for the cask proof. So the particular cask proof I have here is edition, 20E05. I'm not sure which ones you have, but this one is at 58%. We write that on every bottle that we produce, as well as a bottle number. So these are individually hand numbered bottles at the natural cask proof. And first thing you'll notice on this one is we've swung from a golden amber into a deep, dark, like maple color. Beautiful dark maple color, just because of the fact that we have not diluted that whiskey with water at all. So the cask proof whiskey. Oh, and so much more. Yeah, that's right. 92 proof, 46%. So divide by 2. Interesting story on proof. I can tell you later where that came from if you're interested. So the cask proof then, because it's not diluted, is not just more alcohol, but it's more everything. It's more flavor, more all of that. And yes, it definitely jumps up a gear. First thing I get is really rich sugar cookie or toasted, I guess you guys say biscuits, but toasted cookie, like a Christmas sugar cookie kind of flavor. It tastes quite sweet. My tongue is full. There's no sugar in there, but that alcohol comes over really sweet. Rich caramel, icing, but deep flavors as well. Tobacco and leather, really, really rich. Nice mouthfeel.
Yeah, I think this one's quite different from the other two, to be honest, Scott. It really, that sweetness and that richness, it's gonna, it's often said it is almost Christmas time of the year, and this is the kind of stuff that you'd be wanting to drink at Christmas, I would say.
Yeah, fantastic, no doubt. I'm still getting some of the sour sort of citrus kind of notes coming through on my second taste, and lots of rich red fruit building in the base of that spirit. Rich dark purple plums and cherries and things like that. Really lovely. Yeah, the mouthfeel, it coats the tongue. It's really rich. Oh, that's interesting. Sugar paper cigarette, loads of warm spice. Yeah, I guess you're right, John. I could drink this every day. You got to be careful. It's quite high in proof, 60%. So it doesn't drink like that. It's quite smooth for that high of proof. It drinks like a much lower proof, actually. So this is just a great testament to the pot distillation process. And that's an example that we use in America a lot when you're talking about pot distillation, where most of our whiskeys over here are done in a column still. We are, as we say, obstinately inefficient here. Just adding a bit of water to see what opens up in this expression. It just continues to be fantastic. So
each batch, how much variance do you have on batches? I mean, yours is probably different from the one we've got, I would say.
Yeah, we don't have a whole lot of variance among the batches. The variants that we see are what gets sorted into these 3 different expressions that we just tasted. So that's why we've created those 3 different product lines. Plus, it gives us different things to market to different people. You know, the vast majority of people want a simple 80 proof whiskey they can buy at a reasonable price and just drink with whatever, even putting into soda, things like that. Where, you know, the 92 proof is more for the whiskey collectors and the bartenders who like the higher proof. And then, of course, the cask proof being the one for whiskey clubs and people who are really only looking for, you know, what's straight out of the cask. So it does give us a nice range of products to sell, but it also helps us segregate those flavors that we do see those variances in the bottles. If we see something that is completely askew from even these guys, then those are often whiskeys that we will introduce into our cask finishing program. Because those people that want to buy cask finished whiskeys are looking for something that's quite different anyway. And so then we might polish it off with, as I said, a peach brandy barrel that we produced, or we might polish it with a maple cask or a dry curacao cask that we got from a friend's distillery. So those give us some opportunities to change up even the oddballs.
Yeah, and I remember, I mean, the last time I did a tasting with you was in London probably a couple of years ago, and I said to you before we started, I'm not always a huge fan of American whiskey well, I'm obviously biased, you can tell by my accent, but I remember when I did this tasting, the step up and the grades were really, really pronounced, and the quality of the spirit that you make, it's obvious a craft whiskey, whereas some of the other American producers, I'm never quite sure. And that's what I really liked about it at the time. And it kind of stuck in my head. And, and then when you launched in the UK, was it September time? I think you did a little bit of
it's around about September that we signed the deal with our distributor.
Right. And I think that's when I reached out and said, hey, we're doing this festival. I'd love you to come and show off. And it's funny how things just stick in your head like that,
Yeah, I believe at the time, Becky and I were both over in London. We were doing a trade mission trip when we met you. And, I reached back out to everybody once we got the distribution years later, saying, hey, we're still here. We'd like to have business. So it was really wonderful that we maintained that connection. But when it comes to craft, I mean, that's one of the reasons I show the pictures that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, was to show people that we are indeed craft. I mean, it is a handcrafted product, and there's a handful of people putting all these products together. We work really hard to do that. So we don't want to, have somebody think that we just bottled some major juice from some other distillery.
Sure.
Are you putting whiskey into casks all year round? Or is it seasonal in batches?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite understand the question again.
Are you putting whiskey into barrels all year round, or will you make into barrels all year round?
Yeah, we are. Our production is not seasonal, so every single day of the year we're producing whiskey and filling casks. And so the whiskeys are on a seasonal cycle as the seasons go, but we will basically make sure that every whiskey has seen a couple summers and a couple winters and all of that, which evens them all out.
That was sort of the lead-on question, was would you notice a difference if a whiskey had done 2 winters and 3 summers as opposed to 3 summers and 2 winters, so technically same age but different seasons?
Absolutely. So that's a fantastic question. So you, pretty much once we get below freezing here, and here I'm talking about, mid-December through early March, the whiskey goes pretty much dormant because it's just not interacting much at that cold temperature with the wood. And so that's why we have a sort of a vague age statement on the whiskey. Since we're trying to achieve consistency, if it was 3 winters and 2 summers, it might need a bit longer than if it was 3 summers and 2 winters. And so sometimes we'll vary the age of the whiskey based on what we're trying to get for that that single color and flavor that we're trying to get out of the whiskey. So yeah, there are variances there. We try to correct for that with our taste buds.
That's cool, interesting stuff, man. It's fascinating. Such
Yeah.
a just that aging process over there is just so different to what we can do here.
And using virgin casks, the analogy I love to tell my American customers is, who are quite, knowledgeable about Scotch, but actually don't know much about American whiskey, is that, we're using these virgin casks. And the analogy that's useful is that of a tea bag. So, we use that tea bag the first time. And when we do, we get this rich, dark, natural cup of tea that has bold flavors. And you can certainly age tea in a tea bag a second time or a third time, but it takes longer, right? And climate plays a role in it as well. So, of course, a lot of the Scotch is aged in used American bourbon casks. And so it takes longer. Plus the maritime cooler climate of Scotland takes longer to affect that flavor. And so I like to compare it, for instance, say take a 3-year-old Catoctin Creek product that looks like maple syrup and compare it with an Ardbeg. It's even their 10-year-old Ardbeg. And it's blonde, it's yellow, it looks like lemonade, and yet it's 3 times older than our product. And that is a testament to what barrel aging does. And so I'm often pushing back on my American customers when they try to compare Scotch age with American whiskey age. The average age of American whiskey is 3 years old, and most Americans don't even know it because we don't put it on the bottle. But every bottle of Scotch that I have over here has 10, 12, 25, all of these numbers on them, which boldly declare how old they are. So Americans, quite lazy, will begin to associate those numbers with quality grades. And it's simply not the case. It's a matter of preference. The Ardbeg 21 begins to lose all that beautiful phenolic smokiness that is in the 10-year-old, the very young spirit. So I prefer the 10-year-old. I like the smoke. And so just a little bit of sort of barrel philosophy over here that sometimes we have to explain to people about why barrel aging in America is so totally different from what's going on in Scotland. Those virgin casks just impart so much wood. And if we left them forever, the whiskey would get quite bitter, quite tannic, and really undrinkable.
I was about
I've
to
seen
ask,
some
are you
oh,
planning
shut
on...
up, I've asked enough.
Sorry. I was about to ask, are you planning on laying anything down for an age statement? You look at Pappies and stuff like that, and they've got sort of 23-year-old whiskies that they manage to get an age statement on. But
Yeah.
I also appreciate that you're getting horrendous evaporation rates over there. What will you be doing? Are you going to bother trying to do anything, or?
Yeah, we so I often get people asking that very question: when will you have a 23-year-old whiskey? And I say, well, check back with me in about 13 years. So we're a 12-year-old company. The oldest product that we've put out to date was 8 years old. Quite nice, but it took quite a lot of management, and it was just a single barrel, kind of an experiment, our inaugural spirit that we had done a few years ago. We released it. And so we continue to play with that. We are putting some older stuff away, which leads me to this last pour, the Rabble Rouser. This is the older of our stuff, and this is where we're doing most of our more elderly age experiments with. So this is our 4-year-old. This is a bottled and bond whiskey. So if you're not familiar with what bottled and bond means, in the 1800s, just like today, there were a lot of whiskey producers doing a lot of tricks to try to get whiskey to sell. And they were aging it with sawdust and all kinds of things. And the bottled and bond was the first food purity law in America, which basically, in a nutshell, said that all the whiskey that was in this bottle was produced under the bond of the warehouse of the distillery where it was produced. So this was a way of saying this is authentic whiskey made to these strict standards in our facility. and it's the law specified that it had to be at exactly 100 proof, so 50% whiskey ABV, and that's where the Rabble Rouser was produced. Now, when making the Rabble Rouser, because it is going to be laid down for longer in the barrel, Becky will make the whiskey quite differently on the still. She will adjust the plates in the column to open them up completely. So we have a completely unfettered column of steam coming through the pot. And that gives us a more traditional sort of what I would call a hillbilly pot still, a rougher spirit coming off the spirit still. So basically the new make will be rougher and not taste as nice as a young spirit, with the intention that it goes into the barrel and the barrel will smooth out those fusel oils and other rough elements over time. What you'll see then is a more boisterous whiskey here, a beautiful at that 100 proof. So this is our Rabble Rouser. This is quite a rare whiskey here in the US as well. We only usually make, several hundred cases a year of this whiskey, and then release it on allocation across the US. Some markets getting only maybe 12 cases per market. So quite special, quite rare if you get to taste it. Not many people here in America even get to taste it. Oh yeah, I see here ginger, red apple skins, vanilla. 50% is a bit of a sweet spot for the ryes. It's lovely. Yeah, thank you so much. And we've got a deeper, richer Distillers edition. Buttery mouthfeel as well has returned. Yeah, the Rabble Rouser, more kind of, I'm getting a little bit of almost a waxiness in there, like a candle perhaps. Or the taste, smell, sensation of paraffin a little bit. Pastry sweetness. Again, yeah, the sweetness continues to be present. That fruity nuttiness. No taste of mint, dill, or rye. Mint, dill, or greenness in this rye, which would be typical for Midwestern ryes in America. That gives us that interesting terroir aspect of that fruity, nutty kind of profile.
So Scott, you sent a couple of samples direct to us so that we could distribute it for this tasting. It's not available in the UK. Is there any plans to send us some of those cases?
Yeah, we can do that. We're releasing this year's release in February, and so I'll have conversations with Nathan, our distributor, about getting some of that sent over. The trick with it is always managing to get a big enough order that the shipping is worth the trouble.
Well, if you're going to ship some gin as well, we can probably take a few cases of that.
All right. Yeah, if you pop me an email and copy Nathan, that'll help encourage him to pick up a bit of that as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So look for this coming in 2021. If we can make it all happen, I'd love to get some over there to the UK for you guys. It's a lovely spirit and really, really fun one in our profile, showing kind of where we're headed towards the future as well.
Yeah, just let's say from the ryes I've had, it's that sort of aniseed, licorice, mint, orange dill flavours being like the most prominent thing that I've picked up, and that's not here on this, which is really interesting because again, it's just like a variation within rye that you didn't really know existed.
Yeah. And again, this is a distillation difference as well. So unlike the other three, which are all from the same distillate, this distillate is produced differently. Becky producing it at a much lower proof coming off the still. And that gives us a different set of flavors coming out that get played with once they're in the barrel and changed over time.
It's absolutely delicious. When I tried these, as I said, when we decanted them, the third one, the Cask booth strength was the one that kind of stood out for me. And now that you've explained how you've made this, I now understand it a lot better, because I'm not sure what I was expecting after that. I was like, oh, okay, we've kind of come down a little bit. It's got a different kind of taste to it. I wonder why that is, and I think that's the value of having you here, telling us why.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great joy for me, obviously, to be able to answer all these questions, that come in. When do you have opportunity to get the insight like this into a distillery's daily working process? It's a great communication platform. So even though it has me drinking all this whiskey at 9 o'clock in the morning. So
yeah. So
I'll go up and take a nap after this.
I wish I had time. So folks, I'd like to thank Scott for joining the Southport Winter Whiskey Festival. If anybody has got any more questions or any more comments on this beautiful rye whiskey, please make them now.
I'm going to pop into the chat and just put our Instagram handle and Facebook so you guys can hit us up if you need to.
And I'll certainly be talking to Nathan next week about getting some more of this sent up to Southport. We actually sold out of all but 2 bottles from what we ordered.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And I kind of cheekily just put some pretend stock back into on the website, knowing that I can,
like pre-selling it.
Yeah, hopefully I can get some more. So
yeah, I'm sure you can. We have plenty of it in stock over there. We warehouse in Amsterdam, so
okay.
Even if Nathan runs out, we can always get some back over the pond.
Okay. So if anybody wants to buy another bottle or 2, it is available. Except for the Rabble Rouser yet. We will get some of that.
Yes, a little bit of perseverance will get you some.
Good stuff. Listen, Scott, I really appreciate you taking the time out, and it's lovely to talk to you again. And I think you've graced American whiskey at the festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. It's such a pleasure. I really appreciate it.